Hello and welcome to Week 2, Lecture 2 of Film Production for English 2450, COM 2010, Intro to Film. This lecture video is on the 4 stages of the film production process. And you'll remember from my previous video that the filmmaking process includes 3 broad phases. The film is produced, and then it is distributed, and then it is exhibited. So what we're looking at here is the first part of that process, production. How are films actually made? I'm breaking that down into 4 additional steps. So an outline of this video, I will be talking about the 4 steps in chronological order, roughly chronological order, starting with script writing and funding, pre-production, production, and post-production, and we'll be looking at some of the important roles and major players throughout those 4 pieces of this overall process. The next video, and the last one for this week, will talk about distribution and exhibition. And remember that when I'm talking about film production in this video, I'm specifically looking at Hollywood film production post-1948, when the Paramount decision was made. So let's start at the beginning of the process. Phase 1 is script writing and funding. And this is where producers are tasked with securing funding as scriptwriters prepare the screenplay, also known as the script. So this is when there's a concept, there's an idea, it's being written out, and we're trying to get money so that we can actually produce the film. The next step is pre-production. This is preparation. This can take a year, sometimes more. The director is hired and coordinates with staff, locations are scouted, schedule for the shooting is developed, the sets are prepared, the props are prepared. This is getting everything ready so that when production begins, it can go as quickly as possible because production can be very expensive. The third step is production. This is referred to as shooting, principal photography. Usually this takes at least a year, sometimes more, sometimes less. This is where the director coordinates with multiple units to shoot master shots and coverage. Coverage is kind of additional footage that is used as sort of backup, and the master shots are the primary shots that will be used in the final cut of the film. After all of the material is shot, we move into post-production, which is also referred to as assembly, and a lot of times it's just referred to as post, where footage is kind of pieced together, the sound is added, the sound is mixed, and the effects are completed. One important thing to keep in mind about these 4 different steps in this process is that it sounds like they're chronological. And although it seems like these 4 different phases happen chronologically, that they happen in a linear fashion, that's not actually true. It's more recursive and circular than that. So what happens during post-production can affect what happened previously during production. Some of the post-production editing and sound design is actually taking place concurrently to production. Some of the things that happen during production will actually kind of recursively affect things that happen during pre-production. So I don't want you to think of these 4 phases as a linear timeline of how a film is put together. It's more like it circles back on itself. All 4 of these things by the time the film is finished are completed, but they don't necessarily happen one at a time and chronologically. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Another important thing to keep in mind is that during shooting, the film is also not shot in chronological order. They don't shoot the first opening scene, and then the following scene, and then the following scene. The way that a film is put together and shot is very piecemeal. It's based on what cast members are available, what locations are available, and a lot of other kind of logistical issues that can come up during a movie shoot. The thing to remember here is that the process of filming, the process of putting a movie together from start to finish is not chronological or linear. So the next thing I wanted to look at is some of the important roles throughout the film production process, starting with phase 1 and moving through phase 4. I'm not going to read these slides off in detail. You can definitely come back to the Prezi and read them more closely if you would like to, but I want to just give a general idea of who the major players are during these different parts of the movie production process. So in phase one, when we have a script or the start of a script and we're trying to find funding, the important people are screenwriters and producers. At this phase, there may or may not be a director attached to the film yet. The screenwriter is obviously the person who writes the script. And this might be one person or a group of people who are writing an original script or adapting something into a script, like a novel, for example. They write a treatment, which is a synopsis of the action of the film. They might write one or more full scripts, and then a shooting script, which is traditionally thought of as the final version. When I say final, I don't necessarily mean that that version of the script won't be changed in any way, but this is where the screenwriter's role typically kind of ends. Producers are the people who work with the director, the studio, to make sure that there's funding. They're the liaison between the filmmakers and the screenwriters. They work with the financing company to make sure that the film stays on budget. Producers have a lot of different roles and wear a lot of different hats. And there are different types of producers. Executive producers tend to work more on financial aspects. Line producers tend to work more on day-to-day aspects, and associate producers tend to work more on technical aspects. So any film might have an entire host of different producers doing different things throughout the process of making the film. Once you move into pre-production, at this point there's typically a director attached to the film. Sometimes directors are also screenwriters. They might write and direct their own scripts. Often a director is attached to direct someone else's script, though. The director is obviously one of the most important people, if not the most important person on the movie set. They work with the producer, they set up the production offices, which is the headquarters, they find locations, they hire the staff, they may or may not work with the screenwriter if they're not in fact themselves the screenwriter, and they work with everyone else listed here on this slide to get the movie ready for shooting. You have a casting director, which is the person who auditions cast members, production designer, who uses drawings and blueprints to visualize the film, art director is the person who oversees the construction of the actual sets, the set decorator is the person who modifies the sets for different purposes, the set dresser arranges the props during the shooting process specifically, the costume designer is exactly what it sounds like. This is the person who plans the cast wardrobes. And then you have an entire host of graphic artists who produce things like storyboards, pre-visualization, animatics. These are the people who help the director visualize, before a camera is ever even switched on, what do we want this movie to look like? So here are a couple images. There's a storyboard from the film Blade Runner on the left, and there's an animatic on the right of the film, the Grand Budapest Hotel, with a comparative side-by-side of what the actual end result of the film looked like. Now, these are just examples of how graphic artists can help directors envision the final visual product of the film before actually shooting anything. In the production or shooting phase, there are a lot of very important roles, and we can't necessarily, for the purposes of time, go through every single one of these. The important thing is that there are basically 4 kind of groups on this page. The first group is people that work very, very closely with the director. The second group are the people who work mostly with cameras and lighting. The third group are the people who work mostly with sound. And then the last one here, visual effects. This is the person who does things we typically think of as special effects, stunts, CGI, models, miniatures, etc. So in the top group, we have assistant directors, dialogue coaches, second unit directors, the script supervisor, and the cast. Now, all of these people work with the director on a day-to-day basis to make sure that the shooting runs smoothly. As I said before, film production is very expensive. You need all of these people helping the director to make sure everything stays on track. All of the footage that is needed is shot on time and on budget. The second group here includes the cinematographer, also known as the director of photography or the DP. This is an incredibly important person in the film production process. They are an expert on how photography works, lighting, camera techniques. They help choose what type of film stock is going to be used, what type of lenses are going to be used. They supervise the camera operators and the grips and the gaffers. The DP is incredibly important, and we'll talk more about that role when we get to our unit on cinematography. Now, camera operators are the people who actually physically manipulate the camera on set. That's different than the cinematographer, who basically just plans where the camera will be. The grips are the people who move around props and set pieces, lighting and equipment, and the gaffer is the head electrician. They rig and they place all of the lighting. You cannot have a film without lighting, so the gaffer is incredibly important to the overall production of the film. In this third group here, we have people that work on sound. The sound mixer, who records dialogue and ambient sound, and then they kind of supervise the other people in this unit. You have someone who operates the boom microphone. There's another person who places mics, sound cables, controls ambient noise. And then there are sound designers. Now, this is a relatively new phrase that's been used since the film Apocalypse Now came out. And this is basically a person who plans the sound for the entire film. If a visual designer plans what the film will look like, a sound designer plans what the film will sound like. And then the last person here, last but not least important, is the visual effects supervisor, which has become a very, very important role, especially as we move into more and more films using CGI and special effects. Of course, this is not an inclusive list because there are so many other people who work on films that are incredibly important, including makeup artists, hairdressers, caterers, the animal wranglers, the drivers, the production assistants, the interns. You could go on and on forever. There are so many important roles in film production that we can't necessarily get into, but this is just a list of some of the people who are very important during the shooting phase of things. Now, once you move into post-production, it's a little bit different in terms of where the emphasis is placed on who's doing work. Post-production work, though, does occur throughout and after production. So while the film is being shot, these people are actively doing work to put the film together, but after the shooting is finished, they continue that work. So the primary roles here in post-production are the editor, who catalogs and assembles the different takes. They work with the director to decide how to put the footage together. Like I said, it is filmed out of order. Films are not shot chronologically. And because films are not shot chronologically, that means that a lot of work goes into figuring out how to put the best takes together in an appropriate order to make sense of the story. So that's what the editor's job is. Of course, the editor has a lot of help throughout that process. They have a large crew, and it could take months or even years to edit the final cut of a film together. The assistant editor is the person who sorts out the takes. They synchronize together the image and the sound. The sound editor records the film soundtrack and ADR, which is automated dialogue replacement. Foley artists have a really fun job, which is to reproduce everyday sound effects. So in a movie, if you hear a door close, someone's dress swishes as they walk by, someone steps on a crunchy leaf, or it's raining outside, there's someone who recreates those sounds in a studio. And then the composer is the person who composes the music that's synchronized to the film's final cut. We're going to talk more about sound editors, Foley artists and composers in our unit on sound design, and we'll talk a lot more about the editing process when we get to our unit on editing as well. So some important takeaways on the film production process. 1, films are not shot in chronological order. 2, the film production process does not occur in chronological order. It's recursive rather than linear. The things that happen in post-production affect the things that were happening during production and pre-production. And most of these phases overlap with each other. They're actually happening concurrently rather than chronologically. And then the last important piece to remember is that it takes a large crew, a lot of time and effort and organization to work together to create the final product of a film. So as we watch movies this semester, just keep this in mind, that each movie that we watch went through a process of film production, including the planning phases with script writing and financing, the pre-production where everything was prepared for shooting, the difficult process of shooting the film, and then post-production where everything is kind of put back together again. So this was the second video for this week. Stay tuned for our third video, which will talk about distribution and exhibition of films.